8-year-old Robert Saito watched as his parents packed their entire life into 2 suitcases. They had 48 hours, not to evacuate from a natural disaster, not to flee enemy forces, but to prepare for imprisonment by their own government. His crime, being Japanese; his family's crime, being American. In 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and in one stroke of a pen, 120,000 people, most of them American citizens, became prisoners in their own country. No charges, no trial, no mercy. This is the story of what happened when America turned on its own. December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed over 2,400 Americans and thrust the United States into World War II. But the shock waves of that morning would hit far beyond the military base in Hawaii. They would tear through the streets of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle, through neighborhoods where Japanese-American families had lived for generations. Within hours, fear turned to suspicion, suspicion turned to rage, and rage turned to something far worse: policy. The FBI had already been watching Japanese Americans since the 1930s. In the days immediately following Pearl Harbor, community leaders, priests, businessmen, teachers were rounded up and detained. No one told their families where they'd gone, but this was just the beginning. On February 19, 1942, just 73 days after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order didn't specifically mention Japanese Americans. It didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who it targeted. It authorized military commanders to designate exclusion zones and remove anyone they deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast. Approximately 127,000 Japanese Americans lived in the continental United States at the time. About 112,000 lived on the Pacific Coast. Roughly 80,000 were Nisei, second-generation Americans, born on U.S. soil with full citizenship. Another group was Sansei, third-generation, children of the Nisei. The rest were Issei, first-generation immigrants from Japan who were legally barred from becoming citizens because of their race. They were given days, sometimes hours, to report to assembly centers. Families could only bring what they could carry. Business owners had to sell decades of work for pennies. Farmers abandoned crops ready for harvest. Robert Saito's family in San Jose was assigned a number: 32418. Not a name, a number. Montana Governor Sam Ford was blunt about his reasoning. Quote, "Our people cannot tell an American-born Japanese from an alien. When casualty lists start coming in, I fear for the safety of any Japanese in this state." End quote. Idaho's Attorney General was even more direct. Quote, "We want to keep this a white man's country. All Japanese should be put in concentration camps for the remainder of the war." End quote. There was no mass incarceration of German Americans or Italian Americans, despite the fact that the United States was also at war with Germany and Italy. A 1982 congressional commission would later determine what drove this policy. Quote, "Race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership." End quote. The government called them relocation centers. History calls them what they were: concentration camps. 10 camps built across 7 states, mostly in desolate, harsh terrain where few Americans would see them or question what was happening inside. Manzanar in California, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho, Tule Lake, Topaz, Rohware, Jerome, Gila River, Poston, Grenada. Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga was a high school senior when she arrived at Manzanar. She later described her first day, quote, "It was hot and dusty, even though it was only April. The only thing that was in the apartments when we got there were army metal beds with springs on it and a pot-bellied stove in the middle of the room. That was the only thing. No chest of drawers, no nothing, no curtains on the windows. It was the barest of the bare." End quote. Entire families, sometimes 4 or 5 families, shared single barracks divided by thin partitions that didn't reach the ceiling. Privacy didn't exist. You could hear everything your neighbors said, every argument, every cry in the night. Robert Saito's family was first sent to the Santa Anita Assembly Center near Los Angeles, where they lived in former horse stables. They slept on mattresses stuffed with straw that still smelled like animals. Later, they were transferred to Hart Mountain, Wyoming. Hart Mountain in winter was brutal. Temperatures plunged below zero. Families from California had brought summer clothes, expecting to return home quickly. Instead, they ate standing up in mess halls. There weren't enough seats, wearing whatever layers they could find. The buildings were tar paper-covered barracks with minimal insulation. Wind and dust seeped through every crack. Camp residents lost an estimated $400 million in property during their incarceration. Businesses seized, farms confiscated, savings accounts frozen, everything they'd built over decades gone. But life doesn't stop, even behind barbed wire. Families created routines. They started schools in those same tar paper barracks. Kids played baseball in the shadow of guard towers. At Hart Mountain, teenagers formed a poster crew, creating safety announcements and dance posters. People fell in love. Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga was so worried about being separated from her boyfriend that she eloped, to the horror of her parents, just before being sent to camp. Communities formed newspapers. The Manzanar Free Press began publishing less than a month after the first exclusion order. Journalists in the camps wrote, quote, "The Japanese community considered the newspaper as necessary." End quote. These papers, written in English and Japanese, advertised events, reported camp news, provided logistics about relocation, and, remarkably, maintained some sense of normalcy in a profoundly abnormal situation. Babies were born in the camps. Children took their first steps behind fences. Aiko gave birth to her daughter at Manzanar, a child her family in Arkansas had never met. When word came that her father was gravely ill in the Jerome camp in Arkansas, she requested a transfer, traveling across the country with an infant to see him one last time. He died before the camps closed. He died a prisoner. In 1943, the government added insult to injury with a loyalty questionnaire administered to all adults in the camps. 2 questions caused particular outrage. Question 27, quote, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?" End quote. Question 28, quote, "Will you swear unequivocal allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor?" End quote. For many, these questions were insulting. They were American citizens. Why was their loyalty being questioned when they'd committed no crime? Those who answered no to both questions, the so-called no-no boys, were labeled disloyal and sent to the Tool Lake Segregation Center, a camp within a camp for those who dared to resist. The segregation exposed the absurdity of the entire program. If the government could identify and remove the disloyal, why did everyone else need to remain imprisoned? Even officials like Attorney General Francis Biddle and Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes urged Roosevelt to end the program. Roosevelt hesitated, fearing political backlash on the home front. While Japanese Americans were imprisoned behind barbed wire, their government came calling with an offer. Prove your loyalty. Fight for the country that took everything from you. On February 1, 1943, President Roosevelt announced the creation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-Japanese American unit with white commanding officers. The recruitment goal was modest: 1,500 volunteers from Hawaii, 3,000 from the mainland. From Hawaii, where mass incarceration never occurred, over 10,000 men volunteered, nearly 7 times the goal. From the mainland camps, only about 1,200 initially stepped forward. Fear, anger, and betrayal made recruitment difficult. How do you ask someone to die for a country that imprisoned their mother? Daniel Inouye, an 18-year-old pre-med student from Honolulu, explained his decision. Quote, "I was angered to realize that my government felt that I was disloyal and part of the enemy, an enemy alien, and I wanted to be able to demonstrate not only to my government, but to my neighbors that I was a good American." End quote. Others felt differently. Some in the camps refused to cooperate with the draft until their rights were restored. They saw the military recruitment as one more injustice piled on top of many. But about 4,000 volunteers made it to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, for training. Their unit motto became legendary: "Go for broke," a Hawaiian gambling phrase meaning to risk everything for a big win. They'd be risking everything all right. The unit included multiple battalions, artillery, engineers, and support companies. They trained alongside the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 1 Puka Puka, composed mainly of Japanese Americans from Hawaii who'd been drafted before Pearl Harbor and had already distinguished themselves in combat in North Africa and Italy. The 100th had suffered so many casualties, they were called the Purple Heart Battalion. In June 1944, the 442nd arrived in Italy. They fought in Tuscany, in the Maritime Alps, and in brutal mountain combat. The fighting was relentless. The casualties were staggering, but their toughest assignment was yet to come. October 1944. The Vosges Mountains of northeastern France, a region that hadn't been breached militarily since the Roman Empire. The 442nd was sent to rescue the Lost Battalion, 275 soldiers from a Texas National Guard unit who'd been surrounded by German forces due to reckless orders from their commanding general. For 6 days, the men of the 442nd climbed uphill in freezing rain. German artillery fired down on them from fortified positions. They gained small amounts of ground each day, losing soldiers with every yard. On October 30th, they made contact. The radio crackled. Quote, "Patrol from 442nd here. Tell them that we love them." End quote. The rescue was successful. About 211 of the original 275 Texas Guardsmen survived. But the cost was devastating. The 442nd lost over 800 men, killed, wounded, or missing, to save 211. Between October 14th and October 31st, during the campaigns to liberate Bruyères, Bifontaine, and rescue the lost battalion, the casualties were catastrophic. At an award ceremony shortly after, the commanding general complained about the poor turnout from the unit. An officer replied flatly, quote, The rest are either in the hospital or dead, sir." End quote. General George Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, said of the 442nd, quote, "They were superb. They took terrific casualties. They showed rare courage and tremendous fighting spirit. Everybody wanted them." End quote. On July 15, 1946, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team marched down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman reviewed the troops and awarded them the Presidential Unit Citation. He told them, quote, "You fought the enemy abroad and prejudice at home, and you won." End quote. By the war's end, the combined 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team had become the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. More than 4,000 Purple Hearts, 21 Medals of Honor, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, 7 Presidential Unit Citations. Approximately 18,000 Nisei soldiers served in the unit over the course of the war. The original 4,000 had to be replaced nearly 3.5 times. In December 1944, as Allied victory in Europe became increasingly certain, Roosevelt's administration finally declared the period of military necessity over. The camps began releasing prisoners. But where were they supposed to go? Many returned to find their homes destroyed or occupied by others. Their businesses were gone, their savings depleted. Some communities openly threatened violence if Japanese Americans tried to return. Even decorated veterans of the 442nd were denied service in restaurants while wearing their uniforms. 7 years after the war ended, Susumu Sato took his family to a restaurant in Sacramento. They ordered their meal. It never came. Sato recalled, quote, "There's no point in making any commotion, so we just walked out." End quote. In 1948, Congress provided $38 million in reparations, a fraction of what families had lost. 40 years later, in 1988, Congress formally apologized and authorized payment of $20,000 to each surviving individual who'd been detained. It was Aiko Herzog Yoshinaga who helped make that apology possible. For years, she'd accepted the government's narrative that internment was a wartime mistake. But in the 1970s, while living in Washington, D.C., she began researching her own family history in the camps. Her research expanded. She joined the redress movement. In the archives, she discovered a smoking gun, a government report stating explicitly that there was no national security reason for incarcerating Japanese Americans during the war. The imprisonment had been motivated by racism, pure and simple. Her research became crucial evidence in the fight for reparations and a formal government apology. Today, sites like Manzanar and Heart Mountain are National Historic Sites. You can walk through the barracks. You can see the guard towers. You can stand where families once stood and wonder how this could have happened, not in some distant dictatorship, but here, in the United States of America, to American citizens. The stories of the 442nd remind us that patriotism looks different when you're forced to prove it at gunpoint. That loyalty means something entirely different when it's questioned without cause. Most survivors of the camps have passed away now, but their children and grandchildren carry these stories forward, because forgetting isn't an option. Not when constitutional rights can disappear with a single executive order. Not when fear can override justice in just 48 hours. In 1942, The United States government imprisoned 120,000 people without trial. Not one was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage. Not one. The camps are empty now. The question is, have we learned the lesson?